Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out here tonight for our special history program. My name is Jarrett Roll, and I'm privileged to work at the Monroe County Local History Room and Museum. I think most of you know that. Well, tonight we have a special program called Wisconsin for Kennedy, the primary that launched the president and changed the course of history. And before I introduce our special speaker tonight, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about the history room since we aren't physically there. Normally in the past we've had our programs there, but because we've outgrown that space for our public programs, our good friends here at the Sparta United Methodist Church allow us to set up here and to have programs, and we're so thankful to them all. Yes. Our mission at the History Room is to connect people to Monroe County history in a meaningful way. And I've already heard from some of you that this subject matter of when Kennedy came here is meaningful to you because you either were alive during that time or you heard stories from people that were. So that is exciting to hear about. And if not, you're just interested in the subject. Next month, I hope to see you back here on May 15th. That's Thursday, May 15th at 7 p.m. because we have another history program. It's called Went for Broke. It's the remarkable World War II era story of the 100th Infantry Battalion. They were comprised of Japanese-American soldiers, primarily from Hawaii. And they were training at Camp McCoy, when it was Camp McCoy, during World War II, and many local families befriended them and got to know them. And it's just a very interesting story about these group of men who were engaged in a war with their own ancestors, direct family. So, tonight's presenter I would like to introduce is B.J. Hollars, a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire and the founder and director of the Chippewa Valley Writers Guild. He is also a published author, as you will see by the books up on the table up here, and his most recent book being the inspiration for tonight's program, Wisconsin for Kennedy. Now, just to let you know that after our program, copies of BJ's book are available to purchase here, and he's here tonight to sign them. And we also will have some available for sale at the History Room if you can't purchase them tonight, but otherwise I'd encourage you because he's here now. We have refreshments at the back table for when we're finished, and we also have a form. It's a little survey that you take a few moments just to fill out. And the reason why I asked that is because this presentation was requested through what's called the Wisconsin Historical Society's History Makers Tour. And this tour travels throughout the state from 2023 through February of 2027, and it brings history directly into local communities like ours through pop-up exhibits, through object displays, through other activities like public history programs. So there's the form to fill out, but boy, that's a lot of information. I'm so pleased that BJ could be here. I met him a few years ago when he, as a writer, did a story about a Star Wars exhibit that was able to tour around, and it's been a pleasure to know him over those years. As you'll find out, he's just a great public speaker and a joy just to listen to as well. So without further ado, would you please help me in welcoming tonight's guest speaker, B.J. Hollars.
Go ahead, for me. I'll take whatever. Hey everyone, thank you so much. Let's give it up for Jared. Thank you so much, Jared. You guys are lucky to have such an illustrious group of folks, and Hannah in the back, and our hosts tonight here at the church. So thank you all so much, and thank you all for showing up. As Jared mentioned, we met a couple times actually. First time ever, my children and I were at Fort McCoy. We were camping. We popped into the museum. Talk about like red carpet welcome. I mean, it was just like the kids thought, oh great, we're going to a museum, and we were there for like 2 hours because Jared got them talking and looking at stuff, and it was just a wonderful afternoon. So it really is wonderful to have such passionate people in towns like this who can do their part to share the story. What I love about Jared and what y'all are doing too is that you really focus on kind of the local pieces of the larger story. So I'm a big fan of believing that American history is made up of pieces of local history in our own backyard, and that is something we will be talking about tonight. So I'm very excited to share a few Monroe County / JFK local history stories here. I'll need your help. Some of you were there, I was not there. Certainly some of you know these stories better than I do, but the piece of this puzzle that I do know pretty well has to do with a Sparta native, and maybe some of you have heard of this fella, Ivan Nestingen. Am I pronouncing that right? Some of you have heard of this? Maybe Nestingen's grocery store down the road? No? Ooh, good. I got some fresh material for you. So that's a pretty cool guy. Actually, right before I came here, I went on down to 103 West Oak, I believe, and checked out the store. And I actually took a picture and sent it to his daughters because there on the tile, it's a for-rent store. There's actually photographs of the original grocery store there, but it says Nestingen right there in the tile, still written there. So it's just really wonderful to think of Ivan Nestingen, who you'll be learning a lot about tonight, sweeping those very steps 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. So over the past few months, I've read many places throughout the state of Wisconsin, and every time I mention JFK, someone inevitably says, I've got a story for you. And I think that was actually true tonight. I talked to many of you, and many of you had stories as well. But I think that really reflects just how far this guy got around. I mean, he put in the shoe leather, he put in the time, really personalized campaigning in a way that was sort of unheard of in that era in a lot of ways. The problem, though, is that far fewer people ever say that they have a story about his most dogged supporters here in Wisconsin. And they deserve a little airtime, too. So at the heart of this book, it's about them. It's about a team of Wisconsinites who banded together to support Kennedy's 1960 Wisconsin primary run. During a time when Wisconsinites' reception for Kennedy was as chilly as our weather. In the 1960 primary, Kennedy was attempting to do what no winning presidential candidate had ever tried before. Rather than rely on the party's convention, he leveraged the power of a series of state primaries to clinch his party's nomination. And the beginning of that journey took him directly into Wisconsin, the first contested primary race that pitted him against the Minnesota senator from next door, Hubert Humphrey, who was so beloved around these parts that he was affectionately called Wisconsin's third senator. No matter that he was a Minnesota guy, he was our third senator as well. The stakes were very high here in Wisconsin. Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy Sr., called the Wisconsin primary the crisis of the campaign. And the candidate himself concurred. Jack Kennedy told supporters, if I am beaten in Wisconsin, I am out. So I always just like to take a moment to pause and think about that. Had Kennedy lost the Wisconsin primary, we may never have had President Kennedy. So much depended on the Badger State. And in one of the few times in his privileged life, JFK appeared to be at a disadvantage. Here was this silver-spooned East Coast Catholic who hadn't even been to Wisconsin prior to the mid-1950s, facing off against the folksy, farmer-loving Hubert Humphrey, who dedicated his political life to this region. Spoiler alert. Thanks to the doggedness and creativity of a handful of Wisconsinites, Kennedy squeaked out a victory, winning 56.5% of the popular vote in 6 of 10 districts on primary day, April 5th, 1960. It wasn't enough to knock Humphrey out of the race entirely, but it was enough for both candidates to continue on to West Virginia, where Kennedy's victory landed the knockout blow that prompted Humphrey to exit the primary. Wisconsinites did not go easy on Kennedy. But by toughening him up in the primary season, we prepared him for the trial still ahead. In fact, it was here in Wisconsin where Kennedy found his footing for the presidency. Quote, I love this quote, I suppose that there's no training ground for the presidency, Kennedy remarked during a visit to Milwaukee in 1962. But I don't think it's a bad idea for a president to have stood outside of Oscar Mayer's meat factory in Madison, Wisconsin at 5:30 in the morning with the temperature 10 above. Which he absolutely did. Some meat factory workers were happy to meet him, others less so. Regardless, Kennedy greeted them all with enthusiasm until his own hand bled. For Kennedy, a little blood was a small price to prove himself to the state's primary voters. He needed them to know that despite his family's privilege, he too could put in a hard day's work, or several months' worth of hard days on the campaign trail, whatever it took to win over Wisconsin's voters. And he took the fight right down the road from my home in Eau Claire, likely on Barstow Street in January 1960, when an older woman took Kennedy's hands in her own and said, my son, it's not your time. To which a determined Kennedy replied, Mother, it is my time. And then he went all in on Wisconsin. This was the moment that inspired me to try to write the book. The fact that this interaction had occurred just down the road from where I lived, and nobody even knew it. That this older woman on Barstow Street pushed Kennedy forward as if almost daring him to do it. Would he have gone all the way if it hadn't been for her? While Wisconsinites made the biggest impact on their home turf, we can't overlook the better-known out-of-towners too. a parade of Kennedy family members who encamped in Wisconsin throughout the bone-chilling 1960 winter, and who would stop at nothing to get Jack elected. Like Ted Kennedy, Jack's 28-year-old brother, who worked most of the West, but Wisconsin too. And on Valentine's Day, 1960, he took a literal leap of faith for his brother, and more on that in a bit. And also Bobby Kennedy, who I know some folks in the crowd already mentioned having met. Jack's 34-year-old brother and campaign manager, the subject of the book I'm currently working on, who in the winter of 1960 disembarked from a snow-stuck train and hoofed it for several miles through the snow all the way to an event in Eau Claire. And who could forget Jackie Kennedy, the iconic future First Lady, known for her fashion and trend-setting, though, while in Wisconsin, took a when-in-Rome approach and posed with prized hams and led sing-alongs at American Legion halls, and in one truly unforgettable moment, commandeered a supermarket loudspeaker to explain to shoppers in Kenosha why they ought to vote for her husband. Individually, none of these people would have been able to push Kennedy past the finish line to win the pivotal 1960 primary. But collectively, they became unstoppable. I always joke I like to think of them as kind of like the Ocean's 11 political team. Everyone had a specialty, everyone lent their talent to the cause. These people asked not what their country could do for them, but what they could do for their country. And they found their answer long before such words ever left President Kennedy's lips. Since the book was released about a year ago now, I've had some really incredible experiences at readings like this, including in Milwaukee meeting Paul Lucey, the son of Governor Pat Lucey, who's featured in the book. Paul showed up at my reading there in Milwaukee unannounced, shared some incredible stories, including one rather hilarious one about when Kennedy was in Mexico. His dad was an ambassador to Mexico for a time, so remind me at the end and I will tell you a very funny story about Kennedy in Mexico. But a few months back, I received a different note, a different correspondence. It was an email from a 91-year-old man named Mel Catone, who claims to be the last living campaign worker from Kennedy's West Virginia primary team. And he told me about how Kennedy won the primary there, of course, but after he did so, he was sent to Michigan to set up Kennedy's Labor Day events in the months leading up to the general election. How he arrived in Michigan at 25 years old, having never even left his coal-mining town, having never even eaten at a restaurant, and somehow found a way to rally 50,000 Michiganders, Kennedy's biggest crowd to date, on the shores of Lake Michigan, an event which likely played a role in rallying the necessary votes to help Kennedy eke out a pivotal general election win there months later. I also received a letter in the mail a couple months back from a man named Gerald who reached out to share how his father had an also interesting encounter with Senator Kennedy. Gerald's father had lied about his age and joined the military at 14 to fight in World War II. My son is 13. Can't make his bed. I'm just shocked to think of a 14-year-old fighting in World War II. When he finally left the service years later, Gerald had a hard time getting a separation pay. Senator Kennedy happened to be his senator, so he paid him a visit in his office. Senator Kennedy seemed unsure how to get him the money he was due, so he offered his constituent a personal loan. Jack Kennedy offered some random guy a loan. Pulled out his wallet, says, "What do I owe you? We'll get this worked out." Gerald's dad politely declined. All he wanted was the money he was owed. The senator said he'd take care of it, and sure enough, by the time the man returned to his office, not only did he have his separation pay waiting for him, but also a job at the Red Cross. The man had mentioned that he hoped to do something more with his life. He wanted to give service, give something back to his country. And sure enough, by the time he returned back to his office, he had his check and a job. But perhaps my favorite of the unexpected interactions that have occurred since this book has been written was the result of a note I received from the granddaughter of a Milwaukee Journal reporter named Ira Kappenstein, who's a key figure throughout this book, and a man whose dogged reporting personalized Kennedy in a way that she had never known her grandfather before. Ira died at a tragically young age, so of course she was not around to know him at all, but she said that reading the book was probably the closest I'll ever get to knowing him, which is the nicest thing that anyone's ever said about my writing, and it speaks to one of my main objectives of this book: to bring to life on the page those people whose names you may never have heard, to honor their work, and to learn from it in a modern context. And just having spoken to many of you, I mean, we got volunteers of the year in here and people handing out flyers about this reading. Everyone does their part, and that's such an inspiring thing to see, and that was certainly true for the folks you'll read about tonight. So in the early stages of this book, I came across a quote by Rudyard Kipling. It became kind of like a North Star for me. I kept trying to figure out how I could utilize this quote in the writing of this book. And the quote goes like this: "If history were told in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten." So that's what I set out to do, in the hopes that we don't forget. So tonight I'll share 3 brief scenes from the book, starting with one featuring a household name here in Sparta, former Madison Mayor Ivan Nestingen. But before he was Madison's youngest mayor, elected at 34 years old, and before he served as the Health and Human Services Secretary for the Kennedy administration, he swept floors, as I mentioned, for his father's grocery store on West Oak Street, approximately 0.2 miles from where we are tonight. If you walk there now, as I mentioned, you will still see the Nestingen name written in tiles directly beneath the door. Born in Sparta in 1921, he worked from a young age. In the early years, Ivan had no deep political connections or affiliations. What he had was a Norwegian father who instilled in him the importance of a hard day's work. Whereas Jack Kennedy's high school years were filled with pranks, including no fewer than at least one exploding toilet and some medical mysteries, later determined to be colitis, Nestingen's high school years were more subdued and studious. He studied, he managed the Sparta High School basketball team, acted in the senior play. In his senior photo, 18-year-old Ivan is clean-cut with arching eyebrows, a broad nose, and the hint of an impish smile. After being elected as Madison's mayor in 1956, he also became a key Kennedy ally. Known within the campaign as The Rock for his steady leadership, he laid the groundwork for Kennedy's primary run in Wisconsin, serving as a chairman for the Kennedy for President Club. So this first scene picks up on November 13th, 1959, when Ivan, the boy from Sparta, had the somewhat unenviable task of driving then-Senator Kennedy up a hill, through a blizzard, en route to a major event that scared him about as much as the snow. Ivan Nestingen, the mayor of Madison, gripped his steering wheel tightly as he tried to navigate the thick snow falling over Kenosha's slick streets. This was not how Ivan had imagined the day would go. But Wisconsin winters were as unpredictable as the state's politics. Just when you thought you had a read on things, the wind shifted. Politically speaking, Wisconsin was due for a change. The progressive days of fighting Bob LaFollette and his meteoric rise from congressman to governor to United States senator now seemed like ancient history. In recent years, LaFollette's populist legacy had been shunted aside, replaced by a conservative takeover of Wisconsin politics. By 1948, Republicans had won the governorship and both houses of the state legislature, and dispatched Republican senators and congressmen to Washington. This trend held true in 1956 as well, when Wisconsin voters overwhelmingly cast their ballots to re-elect President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Something needed to change at both the state and national levels, Ivan knew, but it would take the right man to do it. Thankfully, that man was seated beside him in the car. Massachusetts Senator Jack Kennedy stared forlornly out the window as the snow continued to fall. In good weather, the 45-minute jaunt from Kenosha to Milwaukee took no more than 45 miles, excuse me. But on this day, the treacherous road conditions slowed them down considerably. It was the kind of Wisconsin welcome Kennedy had come to expect, less a red carpet than a white one. Throughout the day, the weather had increasingly jeopardized Kennedy's appearance at the Kenosha Union Club, and even worse, the one that followed, the kickoff keynote address for the Wisconsin Democratic Convention in Milwaukee. At least Kennedy could take comfort in knowing that Vice President Richard Nixon, who was also in the state that day, would be just as inconvenienced by the weather. For the past 2 days, Kennedy and Nixon had simultaneous trips to Wisconsin, though they both claimed that had nothing to do with future presidential runs. But it was hard to ignore the campaign-style events that dominated their visits. Yet what weighed most heavily on Kennedy's mind that day, as Ivan steered through the snow, was Hubert Humphrey, who was scheduled to close the Wisconsin Democratic Convention the following evening. That Humphrey would win Wisconsin seemed to many people a foregone conclusion. From his early years as Minneapolis mayor to his decade in the Senate, the affable, farmer-friendly Humphrey had claimed Wisconsin as a second home. Humphrey was particularly popular in the Protestant-leaning agricultural districts of western Wisconsin, leaving even less room for Kennedy to make inroads. Then, on Kenosha's Washington Street Hill, the tires of Ivan's Chevrolet suddenly struggled to gain traction. Ivan planted his foot on the accelerator, hopeful that the tires might catch. The engine hummed, then roared to no avail. As the tires spun, Kennedy, who was far better disposed to Palm Beach sunshine than Kenosha snow, opened the door and quickly climbed out of the vehicle. Ivan turned just in time to see the senator heading toward the back of the car. Ivan watched in his rearview mirror as a tan-faced Jack Kennedy heaved his full weight against the bumper. This was no Addison's disease-ravaged Jack, but the man who'd spent his youth running for touchdowns in Hyannisport, and who, 16 years earlier, had saved his PT-109 crewmates after surviving a Japanese destroyer attack. As Jack pushed hard against the back of the car, streetlights splashed light all around him. Not a spotlight, not yet, but close. The slush-filled street slipped beneath him, but Jack held firm, one foot in front of the other, inching the car upward. A separate car had been traveling behind Ivan and Jack, carrying Irish Mafia members Kenny O'Donnell, Dave Powers, two of Kennedy's most loyal allies. Within moments, Kenny and Dave were at Jack's side. Together, the trio managed to ease the car up the snowy hill until at last the tires caught. From his place a few cars back, Milwaukee Journal reporter Ira Kappenstein watched the scene unfold. No image could more fully foretell the primary fight to come. A Kennedy versus Humphrey Royal Rumble, which for the former would prove quite an uphill battle indeed. How, after all, could an elitist East Coast Catholic ever compete with a beloved salt-of-the-earth Midwestern Protestant? The answer, with help from those who believed in him. The political climb would be steep, but Kennedy was all fight, all grit, all vigor. Ivan needed only to glance in the rearview mirror to see it. I love that scene because, again, it's a perfect metaphor. I love it. I love the idea that the guy who was driving the car lived right here, 0.2 miles down the road. It's a pretty cool thing, and I know when I texted his daughters an hour ago, they were just so thrilled to know that their father's name would be said aloud in this place again. This was a very meaningful place to Ivan, to be sure, and it's nice to kind of bring him back in the room in some way. Something we often forget about, of course, is that there was a time when John F. Kennedy was hardly a household name, even here in Wisconsin, and perhaps especially here in Wisconsin. There was sort of this famous moment. It was St. Patrick's Day. I think it was March 17th, 1960. He's touring a lot of the Ashland area, these sorts of things. He comes up to some folks at a bar, kind of the barfly sitting there, and he puts out his hand. He says, "Hey there, my name's Jack Kennedy. I'm running for president." And the guy looks up from his beer and goes, "President of what?" And so he got a lot of that for a while there until he kind of started to rub off on people and people got a sense to know him. During some visits here in Wisconsin, he had such a hard time finding places to speak that they only put him in elementary schools, and he often joked, if we can lower the voting age to 9, we're going to sweep the state. He was very popular with the under 18 vote. While some were aloof of Kennedy's presence, of course, and didn't even know his name, there were others who were very familiar with his name, or at least they were familiar with the Kennedy name, as was the case on February 23rd, 1960, when a man named Carol Yaskow attempted to introduce the future president and fell a little short. 48-year-old Carol Yaskow smiled as he listened to the laughter that filled the dining room of Madison's Hotel Lorraine. This was the perfect venue for the night's festivities, the Wisconsin chapter of the American Institute of Architects' annual convention. As state architect, Carol had become adept at seeing the artistry in places others often overlooked. A different kind of artistry was required in pulling off a night like tonight. So far, everything was going as planned. State chapter members were happily filled at every white linen covered table, exuding an air of opulence in their suits, ties, and dresses as the cocktail hour gave way to dinner. Carol, who preferred a drafting table to a banquet table, nonetheless had agreed to serve as the evening's MC. Looking around the room, he was pleased to see that everyone appeared to be enjoying themselves. Maybe a little too much, but so what if his colleagues indulged a bit? If anything, would help his jokes land with a bit more zing. Yet the best joke of the night was the one Carol hadn't prepared for. Carol was sitting at the front table of the hotel dining room when a fellow architect and chapter committee member approached him. The committee member had learned that Jack Kennedy and his wife Jackie were staying just a few floors up with their campaign staff, and they were about to head out for a campaign event. Would it be all right, he asked Carol, if he invited the Kennedys to pay a quick visit to the architects? Sounded wonderful, Carol said. Getting to meet a presidential candidate from either party was something he thought the architects in the room would appreciate. The elevator doors opened, and a dapper Jack and a dazzling Jackie began their cinematic descent down the balcony stairs. It was a grand entrance that should have silenced the room. Two famous and breathtakingly beautiful people dressed in their best, walking down the architectural world's equivalent of the red carpet. But the architects at their tables, absorbed in their discussions and drinks, barely took notice, except for Carol, who beamed as the Kennedys made their way toward the front of the room. Later, Carol would wonder if the lack of attention the Kennedys received had something to do with the Republican-leaning crowd. For his own part, Carol welcomed them warmly, grasping Jack and Jackie's hands and thanking them profusely for taking the time. Would you care to say a word or two to the architects of our state?" Carol asked. Jack, who hadn't even known who was in the room 2 minutes prior, happily agreed. He proceeded to give, as Carol would later describe it, quote, "an extemporaneous, spontaneous talk on the responsibility of the architect to society." He called it the exploding society, and that made a tremendous impact on those people, and I'm sure unwittingly he gained some votes. Carol listened in awe. "The great regret of my life," he would go on to say, "was that someone forgot to turn on the tape recorder." But that wasn't his only regret of the evening, because immediately before Jack's speech, Carol would commit a blunder so memorable that its legend soon surpassed the speech itself. Reaching for the microphone, Carol quieted the crowd and began his introduction. "We have with us tonight a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president," Carol said, "and I thought you would like to see one in the flesh." The crowd chuckled. "I introduce you to," Carol began, "Senator Robert Kennedy." As Carol turned to pass the mic to Jack, the room erupted in uproarious laughter. Confused, Carol replayed the introduction in his mind before revealing the terrible truth. Had he said Senator Robert Kennedy? It was an innocent mistake, but also mortifying. A good-humored Jack accepted the mic with a grin and said, "Yesterday I was in Eau Claire, and a nice old lady came up to me and said, 'Mr. Kennedy, I'm just so glad that your sons are taking an active part in public life. I think that's just wonderful.' So I said, 'Thank you, madam, but I happen to be one of those sons. You're talking about my father.' The laughter grew. Just before that, I'd been up to Wausau, where the skiing was pretty good, and some of the young people got around me and said it was just wonderful that I found time to ski up there last weekend. And I had to tell them that was my brother, Ted." Louder still. "Best of all was over in Sheboygan," Jack continued, "and a very nice pair of ladies came up to me and said, 'Oh, it's just wonderful that busy people like you can still find time to have a large family of children.' So I just had to sadly tell her that was my brother Robert." But then even Carol was laughing. "He took me off the hook so beautifully," Carol later reflected. If this had been Carol's only encounter with Jack Kennedy, it would have made for a pretty good story. But what happened next made for a better one. A few weeks after his embarrassing mishap at the Hotel Lorraine, Carol was lounging in the all-but-empty Madison airport, awaiting his late-night flight back home in Wausau. Suddenly, there was a slight commotion as people gathered to get a glimpse of a plane taxiing toward the gate. Carol looked up. It was Kennedy's plane. No, Carol thought, impossible. It was freezing that night, about 20 degrees below zero. When Kennedy appeared in the airport terminal moments later, he was hatless, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his thin blue topcoat, his shoulders raised toward his ears. Kennedy's eyes soon drifted toward Carol on the opposite side of the room. Carol tried making himself invisible, to little avail. Though they had only ever seen each other during those few embarrassing moments in the hotel ballroom, Jack's look confirmed that he remembered everything. Grinning, Jack strode in Carol's direction. Leaning forward, hand outstretched, he said, "Bobby Kennedy's the name." Carol didn't know whether to burst out laughing or drop dead on the airport floor. "I'm sorry," Carol said miserably, "for what happened that night." Jack smiled, "the big problem is those 3 stories I told after, they were all true. I didn't even make them up. They just seemed to fit." Jack excused himself for a moment to greet the 20 or so folks who gathered to see him. "I'm Jack Kennedy. I'd appreciate your interest in the upcoming election." And then, once the hobnobbing was complete, he turned back Carol's way. By then, Carol had taken a seat on a hard bench, resting for the flight ahead. It was a little past 10 o'clock, and after a long week, Carol was anxious to go home to see his family. He wasn't the only one who needed some rest. Exhausted, Jack sank beside him, stretched out his legs, and said, "If I fall asleep, wake me up before my crew gets here." Carroll promised the senator that he would. Jack, who'd become adept at catching a few winks wherever he could, was asleep within seconds. Reclined on the bench, it was as if all the pressures of his presidential run suddenly faded. He sat there for some time, completely uninterrupted, as Carroll tried to trace the strange circumstances that had led him to this moment. First, the chance run-in at the Hotel Lorraine, and now a second run-in at the airport. Of all the ways the stars might have aligned, this seemed rather fortuitous. Carroll was glad for the chance to brush shoulders with greatness, even if he paid the price with a bit of embarrassment along the way. The minutes passed in silence until Carroll spotted his plane taxiing toward the gate. Though he'd never woken a senator before, he figured a bit of humor might get the job done. Tapping the senator, Carroll said, Bob, it's time to go." Jack woke with his humor intact. "Yes, Ted," Jack grinned sleepily. And then they were gone, both Bob and Ted moving their separate ways. Can you believe that even occurred? I read that in the transcripts, and I was like, that is just, clap for them, don't clap for me. They're fun. I was trying to figure out what to read tonight. My wife loves this scene. She thought it's a great way, to kind of get some humor in here, and she thought it really she made a point. She said, could you imagine any presidential candidate today being so graceful about such a botched introduction? But the fact that Jack Kennedy was so quick to make a joke out of it, to make himself the butt of the joke, says a lot about him. And something I really admired was his ability to use humor to deflect, to use humor to protect, to use humor for all sorts of ways to ingratiate himself with folks along the way. So I've only met one president in my lifetime, and I also had a little bit of a flub. It was a different flub, but no less funny, in my opinion. It was in 2007. I was the graduation speaker at Knox College, and our commencement speaker was former President Bill Clinton. It was a big deal, It's a small school. It was pretty impressive to get someone of this stature. And before the speech, we all gathered in this room. It was a room actually where a famous Lincoln-Douglas debate took place there many, many years before. So it already had some presidential history in this room. There was the chair that Lincoln allegedly sat in, which I would sit in every chance I could to try to get those vibes. So we're there, we're meeting President Clinton, and I shake his hand, very nervous, and I said, gosh, how am I supposed to follow you? I mean, here's a guy who is pretty much known for his rhetoric, and he looks at me, and he goes, I don't really know. But he was very concerned for me. He never thought that people had actually followed him in the speaking order. To his credit, he stuck around for the whole speech, and that was more than he was supposed to do. So it worked out okay in the end. So I'm going to close now with one final scene that I'd love to get some questions or stories from you. Since it's a hometown crowd, I wanted to make sure we could bring Ivan Nestingen back in one last time. But we're also going to bring in Ted Kennedy, Jack's younger brother, who again on Valentine's Day 1960 went out on a limb and also a ski jump to help his brother any way he could. Standing at the top of Tomahawk Ridge in Middleton, Wisconsin, 28-year-old Ted Kennedy took a deep breath, then fit his borrowed skis into the icy tracks of the ski jump. This was the Black Hawk Ski Club's annual ski jump competition, an event that was expected to draw nearly 10,000 spectators, or rather 10,000 potential voters from Wisconsin's 2nd District. Ted was accompanied by Madison Mayor Ivan Nestingen, who helped Ted's work the crowd. If Ted had wondered what kind of people flung themselves from steep wood-framed ramps to determine who could fly the farthest through the frigid air, the answer was now clear. Wisconsinites. This was a far cry from what Ted had meant when he told Jerry Bruno, one of the handlers, that he liked to ski. He meant slopes, not jumps. But that shouldn't have mattered. They were supposed to be here working the event, not actually competing in it. Earlier that morning, after picking up Ted from the airport, Ivan Nestingen had suggested that Ted change into ski clothes, complete with a pair of jumping skis borrowed from one of Ivan's friends. Not because Ted had to ski, Ivan had a shirt, but simply so he would look the part for the crowd. Ted was happy to do it. What better way to win over the voters than to prove he was one of them? After suiting up and arriving at the jump, he even took a leisurely run down the hill. Why don't you go over that practice jump over there and take a look at it, Ivan suggested. But don't others go off unless you really want to. Unless he wanted to. Ted didn't mind a downhill run on soft snow, but the odds of him voluntarily launching himself 190 feet through the air was slim. Still, he agreed to have a look. But as soon as Ted and 4 fellow skiers had marched to the top of the jump, ostensibly to have a look, The Marine band down below suddenly began to play the Star-Spangled Banner, a signal that the competition was about to start. Ted turned back toward the steps from which he'd come, checking to see how easy it might be to slip back down undetected. Unfortunately, his plans were interrupted by the announcer's voice booming over the loudspeaker. Now at the top of the jump, Edward Kennedy, the brother of Senator John F. Kennedy. Edward had never jumped before, but maybe if you all give him a big hand, he'll give it a try. Somewhere far below, Ted figured, Ivan was probably having the laugh of his life. Later, Ted would find humor in it as well, but not in that moment. Ted inched forward on his skis, craning his neck to get a better look at the slick tracks just ahead of him. With his very pregnant wife Joan at home, now wasn't the best time to risk breaking his neck. Of course, he'd do almost anything for Jack, and he'd already proven himself as an asset to his brother's political life by managing Jack's successful 1958 bid for Senate. But organizing and canvassing was one thing. Flinging himself down an icy ramp was another. Here he comes, ladies and gentlemen, the announcer continued. What a true sport he is, and I'm sure the senator would be very proud of him. Far below, the Marine band began a drum roll as the crowd shouted and whistled in enthusiasm. Now or never. If not now, Ted knew there would be hell to pay. It was either jump, Ted recounted later, or if my father found out, I'd have to go back to Hyannisport and lick stamps for the rest of the campaign. He glanced toward Ivan, who offered little help. The only way down was down. Gritting his teeth, Ted peered past the crowd and the cars and pointed his ski tips down the tracks. Then he let gravity do the rest. He tried to slow down, but with every passing foot he picked up speed. Then it happened. He was sailing through the Wisconsin air. It was over in seconds. Ted collapsed into a thick pile of snow, dusted himself off, and slowly stood. The crowd roared in appreciation. It had all happened so fast. 1 minute he was safe at the top of the jump, the next he was airborne, and now he was regaining his bearings on solid ground, and adrenaline pumping, walked over to the broadcast booth. The announcer handed Ted the mic. He could have come up with a few choice words for Ivan, but something got the better of him. And he chose instead to use his platform wisely. Did anybody see Hubert Humphrey at the top of that jump? Ted asked. Then support my brother John. Oh, I love that story too. So how this all worked out in the end, of course, was that despite all the Kennedys' efforts, they did in fact win the state. They won 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So they won 6 districts, they lost 4, but they lost here. They lost in Monroe County. This was Humphrey territory. Humphrey won with 35,000 votes to 27,000 votes for Kennedy. Again, Kennedy made up for it in a very tight Wisconsin race, and you know the story from there. So, you've heard a lot about Kennedy tonight. God bless you. Thanks for listening. And I'm always kind of figuring out what do I leave with? How do we leave this story behind? You know. And I think there's something here. Maybe we can learn about it for the modern moment. And I think this is kind of regardless of politics, regardless of any of that, but simply that in a time when democracy's future seems fragile, I hope that every reader can take a lesson derived directly from Kennedy's Wisconsin team. Namely, that you needn't be the richest, or the most well-known, or the most connected to enact real and lasting change. As cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. Or take it from the president's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, who in 1966 remarked, each time a man stands up for an idea, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy, and daring those ripples to build a current that can then sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Kennedy taught us that one person can make a difference, and that every person has an obligation to try. You need only look as far as Ida Nestingen as proof. A man may die, nations may rise and fall, but an idea lives on, Kennedy said. Ideas do. And perhaps America's greatest idea is that in good times and bad, we are stronger together. We just have to remember what together looks like. Thank you all so much. I'd love to take your questions. Show and tell items too, as you're thinking of these questions. Of course, I've got the Eau Claire Daily Telegram from the Kennedy assassination, so this was close to my desk every day. I kind of keep it next to me. My wife got me this Kennedy campaign pin for my 40th birthday, very exciting. And then something very special I got from a reader, a gentleman in his late 80s. He read the book, I forget where, he's somewhere in Wisconsin, and he got to spend a day with Jack Kennedy during one of these tours. And if you know this story, John F. Kennedy, of course, served on a PT-109 boat during his Navy years. Incredible story. But ever since then, during his campaign, he would have these PT-109 pins made. And he would give them as tie clips to his inner circle. So it was very rare if you were, not that rare, but it was pretty cool if you got one, right? So this gentleman who read the book sent it to me in the mail, and I just treasure this. To think that it was handed to him, it just gives me chills every time. So what do y'all want to talk about? You want to share some stories of what you remember from those days, or interactions you had, or any questions you might have for me? I'll do my best, but again, you're all the experts on this neck of the woods. Yeah, what do you got, sir? The mic records repeated. Okay.
I was a 10-year-old kid.
Okay.
I remember my mother telling me that President Kennedy to be was at the Equity Livestock Building in Sparta, which was about a 100-yard walk through the woods over there. So I went over there and was able to meet Mr. Kennedy and to shake his hand. I was probably a 10-year-old kid. But I'll always remember that, going over there.
Walking through the woods to meet the future president.
Yep, went over there, it was, livestock, they were having an auction there.
Okay.
And livestock auction, and went over there, and there he was, and shook his hand.
Did he seem out of place in a livestock auction? Did he kind of try to find his way around?
I remember I was a 10-year-old kid.
Right.
I just remember, heading over through the woods from the house over to the livestock.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's an incredible story. And it's funny you mentioned that. Yeah, that's fine. I love these stories. I love the content. Thank you. There's another scene in this book where Bobby Kennedy got called to be a part of a 4-H. There was a bull contest or something. So here's this East Coast guy who's probably never even seen a cow in his life, is suddenly trying to help the 4-H judges decide who wins the contest. There's this ridiculous photo. But part of the story that I love is all the Kennedys knew nothing of Wisconsin, knew nothing of Wisconsin culture, and yet here they are jumping off ski lifts and eating cheese curds and going to 4-H fairs and doing some ice fishing, and it was just, they did everything they could to pretend that they were Wisconsinites. And sometimes they work better than others, but you got to give them points for trying. Any other stories or questions you might have for me? Here's one. Yes.
So, would it be safe to say that in the various books that you've written, that you've taken the subject that you feel you want to write about, whether it be the Kennedy or some other way, and just just live into that story for a period of time to be that person, to understand it, and so on and so forth. So, assuming that's correct, how would you characterize the period of the Kennedys, or Jack Kennedy, to, let's say, the last presidential election, as to the values that people wanted to talk about or profess in terms of really big statesman issues? I mean, do for your country, these kind of big thoughts, or the whole race to the moon thing or whatever. That these very inspirational things I don't even know how to characterize the rhetoric of the current time, but it's much more focused around many more groups and many more interests, it seems.
That is a great observation, and to your first point, yes, when I write these books, I live in a different world. I couldn't tell you what happened in today's newspaper, but I'll tell you exactly what happened this day in 1960, So for the past year, I was mentioning I'm working on this Bobby Kennedy book, and so my head is just living in Bobby Kennedy 1963 to 1968. And there's a time, my first book's not here, but when I was writing that, I was teaching college classes in Alabama. I have no memory of that whole year other than writing this book. I lived a full life, but I couldn't tell you what I did other than write the book. And I think, for me, that's when the best books come. I wouldn't recommend living that way. I think I found a better balance now, but there is something about reading the newspapers from those days that you're looking at, watching the YouTube clips, watching old news with Walter Cronkite, and these things to get a sense of the world at that moment, since I didn't live then. As to your kind of second part of the question, it's such a different world, and again, the press always wants me to say that my thoughts are my own and don't represent the press because they don't want to get in trouble, but I'll keep my thoughts mostly to myself as well. I think it's safe to say that right now there seems to be a lot of fracturing. There's a lot to be gained, people think, by finding ways to divide us. And gosh, every time I talk to a group of folks in a room, I find myself having something in common with every person. And maybe not everything politically, but plenty of these, all the so-called differences we have are actually pretty slim. And when you actually get to know the person, get to know your neighbor, it's not so different after all. Everyone wants America to be great, everyone wants America to be its best and to help Americans. And so if you have kind of core values of these simple things, I think we can find policies that fit those things. In my head, of course, it was a different time. The Kennedy era was Camelot, and it was all perfect, and of course that was also not the case, right? Kennedy had, if we got into all the horrific and treatment of women and all kinds of things Kennedy did, we would be here all night, you know? So I don't want to make him too much of a hero. But what I really do admire about him, and what I think we are lacking today, is what Bobby Kennedy actually came up with the term, which is moral courage. And moral courage, according to Bobby Kennedy, is telling the people within your own party that is wrong, that is unacceptable. And again, this works for all parties, works for the whole spectrum, you know? So it's very easy to agree with the people you agree with, but it's a lot harder to be like, you know, that's not who we are. And so Bobby Kennedy made very few friends and alienated many people by doing that consistently. But I feel like there's no less of that these days. If you vote against your party, you're demonized, you're gonna have a primary someone running against you, it's a whole different world. Disagreement is no longer a part of that equation, it seems. But that's not a great answer. Yes, what else you got?
The whole idea of, you know, we choose to go to the moon,
Yeah.
you know, not because it's easy, because it's hard. And, you know, that wouldn't last for more than one news cycle these days.
No, I know.
But people got behind that. They really did.
And I guess I'll ask you all, like, what do you think that was? What is it about, like, is it just because it was like a challenge we could all work together to achieve? It seemed like there was no...
Well, the Russians were behind it.
Sure, there you go. Common enemy helps.
We didn't want to be friends with them then.
Yeah, right. We had to beat the moon, gave us something to try for together. But there are plenty of things.
But that's what America's about.
I know, I agree with you. There's so many things I think we could all agree on, you know? Like, find a cure for cancer. You think that would be something we could all get behind, you know? All kinds of things. Public education, like things that, you know, would help our kids, help our communities. So hopefully we can get back to a place, you know, we can all be together and find those ways. Yeah, Jared, what do you got?
Thank you, BJ. Would you be able to just share a little bit about when the people from Sparta, from Tomah, when they went to these public speaking events that JFK was at and Hubert Humphrey, like what were each of their speaking points that they tried, what did they say to try to get, you know, someone from Sparta to vote for them?
Yes, and great question. Kind of, how would they tailor their remarks for the cities they went to? And I should have tried to do a better job of looking up specifics about his visit in Sparta. I was kind of relying on the Nestingen story to get me through. But what he really did, is what he would do, and I love this. This is especially true in the kind of Eau Claire, Cadoc area over there, the 9th District, western Wisconsin, was he would get local drivers. And so the local driver would drive him from place to place, and as he would drive, he'd like want everything he could get from these places. Just soak it up, write some notes, and then kind of regurgitate it back to the people. And so there's a great story where he was in Chippewa Falls, and there's a moment where, of course, agriculture is huge in Wisconsin. So he's always trying to learn like what a cow is, and just basic things he should know about the dairy industry. He was trying to do some dairy legislation to help us out. But he's doing this talk at this deli in Chippewa Falls, and this big farmer guy with overalls. He goes, you know, no offense, Senator, but I don't think you know the first thing about being a farmer. And Jack Kennedy, again using the humor, says, well, I will tell you one thing about farming. A farmer is outstanding in his field. It just diffused everything, you know? I just love that stuff. So he used humor to get away with his lack of knowledge. I'm certain that in this area he was talking about whatever industries were most relevant at the time. Was that agriculture and that kind of stuff as well?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if there was a general a general platform that he had when he came through western Wisconsin. Not so much about Sparta, but
yeah, you know, I think it had to do with agriculture, it had to do with dairy. Later, you get a lot of questions about religion. Of course, this was like a huge hallmark issue, and he wouldn't quite figure out how to persuade people that as a Catholic, he wasn't just going to do whatever the Pope said until that September. And there's a Houston thing with all these pastors, and he said, you know, if I was disqualified from running the president the minute I was born Catholic, that disqualifies a significant number of our population. And that was the moment where everything kind of clicked and you realized religion wasn't going to be the thing that broke his campaign. So I think that was always an underlying issue here. The Protestant districts he did not do terribly well in, so he was always kind of trying to work that angle to prove himself to be his own man in that way. Any final questions, bro? I do have one final page I can read to you at the end from the new book that I'm working on about Bobby, but any final thoughts from you? This is so fun. Thanks for all these great questions. Yeah?
just out of curiosity.
Yes.
So obviously we all know that he went on to proclaim that we should go to the moon. I'm the director of the Deke Slayton Museum.
Oh my gosh, amazing.
So Deke Slayton, one of the Mercury 7,
Yes.
would have been hired in '59. Do you know if Kennedy was aware when he came to Wisconsin that a Mercury 7 astronaut was from here?
Slayton would have been pretty young at that point too, though.
I'm wondering about that time. Like, do you know how old would he have Deke Slayton? Like, well, do you know when he was born?
Was Kennedy here in '60?
He was here at 60 for sure.
Yeah. 59
Yeah,
and
so
60.
59,
Okay.
April of '59 is when,
Mercury went up?
no, that's when the Mercury 7 astronauts were announced.
Okay. Oh my gosh. I've never seen any transcript where he mentioned Deke Slayton directly. But you know what? As soon as we're done, I'm going to go to the JFK Museum. One archive online is type in Deke Slayton. Because there's any mention of him, it'll pop up in a minute, and that would be so exciting to know. That's a great question.
And he may not have been, very into, I mean, NASA was so new that
Right.
maybe it wasn't even something he was
radar.
looking into, but, just a few years later.
Yes, he would care a lot, wouldn't he? Yes, he would. Oh, that's a great question. I wish I had an answer. The other kind of interesting Wisconsin connection that's kind of a big mystery is that his sister Rosemary was placed in an institution here because of his father and some horrific medical lobotomy, I can think of the word, lobotomized, and was placed in care here in Wisconsin. So there's a big question whether or not JFK actually ever visited her when he was here. There's one story, one person claims that allegedly he snuck out in the dead of night to kind of visit her one time. But no one could ever really confirm that story. Certainly the later Kennedys would visit her a lot and really help folks with special needs and these sorts of things. So that's the other mystery. But no, it's a great question. I'll try to do a little Google search and let you know. I'll send you an email.
Cool, thanks.
That's great. Oh, yes.
Just, I never heard of Ivan Nestingen.
Yeah.
And I looked it up while you were talking on here. Kennedy appointed him to be Secretary of Health and
Human Services.
Education,
Yep.
Health and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And according to Google, he was instrumental in helping get Medicare started. And I would guess that over 50% of us in here are. And they started from a Sparta boy.
Isn't that
I find
incredible?
interesting.
And that's true. That's
And
absolutely
a tie
true.
through Kennedy.
I'm so glad you mentioned
The
that.
other thing is Kennedy was instrumental. He was the one who started Peace Corps.
Of course, with Humphrey.
Yeah, well, my son served in the Peace Corps, and I knew a lady that, they lived in Sparta at her point of death, but she was one of the first people that served as a nurse in the Peace Corps. So Kennedy does have a lot of ties to everyday life.
Thank you for sharing that. And you're so right, the Medicare thing, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Nestingen has such a legacy. He didn't really want to do it. I think he had, according to his daughters, he had plans to run for governor. I think he would have won. He was very popular here at that time. But he just felt this desire to serve. And that was the place he knew he could do the most nationally. And look at us all today. He left quite a legacy. And you mentioned the Peace Corps. Something we haven't talked about much, but I just love to point it out because the dirty secret of this whole book is I might have voted for Humphrey. Humphrey was doing incredible work. He was working on civil rights platforms in 1948 before people knew what civil rights was. This guy did a lot of good stuff, especially for Wisconsin and Minnesota.
But back in those days, the Republicans and the Democrats were working hand in hand.
Yeah.
They weren't adversaries as much as they were partners in what they could do for their country.
Right, they were all living together in D.C. and hanging out and getting drinks. It was a whole different time, But of course, this was the primary season, so we get two Democrats who were kind of going head to head. But in West Virginia, Humphrey was trying so hard to win West Virginia that he wrote his last check, $700 that was supposed to be for his daughter's wedding the next week, to buy some airtime, to try to get past John Kennedy. He just couldn't do it. And so it's just this devastating story of Silver Spoon, East Coast Jack Kennedy with all the money in the world, and Hubert Humphrey, son of a pharmacist, doing his best, and just couldn't quite pull it off. You'd think he would resent Kennedy for that, but in fact, as soon as that was all said and done, Humphrey went right back to Minnesota, pushed for John Kennedy, got him the state, nearly helped get Wisconsin, helped him win the election, and then, of course, helped Kennedy form the Peace Corps and so many other things. And my favorite story about these two is there was a moment where they're sitting in the Oval Office together, and Kennedy had a terrible day. I don't know if it was like Bay of Pigs, something bad had happened. And Humphrey's looking at him, and he goes, "How did it go?" Jack Kennedy goes, if I knew how hard this was going to be, I would have let you win. And Humphrey says, oh, I knew how hard it was going to be, which is why I let you win. The fact that these two adversaries, like, it was really a bloody battle for a while, could find ways to work together. I mean, certainly the same party, even after how personal it got, I think it's really an impressive feat to kind of let those things go and work together to get the job done for folks.
Mhm.
Final thoughts from you, and I'll show that last page. Yes?
Is anybody else here from Tomah? Or am I the only one? One of the reasons that I'm here is I need some clarification. My grandfather worked at the VA hospital in Tomah, and he actually gave Kennedy a tour when he came through Tomah. And I have a picture at home, all of my relatives have one, of Kennedy standing next to my grandfather. But he was there to tour, I think, the Tomah High School, and as well as the VA hospital. Now, was that when he was running for that primary, or when he was running for president? Because I'm not sure if that was 59 or 60.
Okay.
It was March of '60.
March of '60, so that was the primary then. Way to know it. Way to know it. I was not sure, but I've seen a lot of newspaper reports about the Tomah school visit, but I don't remember the VA. I don't think there was a. I'm glad you have a photo. I hadn't seen the photo.
That's very treasured in all of our families.
Yep. The image that we used on our flyer to promote this is of him. I mean, it's cropped, but it's of JFK at the canteen at the VAMC.
Oh my gosh.
Really,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, so we have a big file on both the 59 and 60 visits and photos from that.
Oh, so
Yeah.
please check this stuff out.
And I just want to make a point, because I've been a very avid follower of anything involving Kennedy's, good or bad. But, you know, I'm 68 years old. I was 7 years old when he passed away. And I remember that day, I'm sure many of you do, as vividly as it were yesterday. Certain days you remember, like 9/11 occurring, the Space Challenger blowing up. That's one of them you don't forget. I was just a little boy when it happened, second grade.
What do you remember about that day specifically?
I remember being in school and the teacher from across the hall coming and telling us, and she was crying, but we didn't know why till our teacher told us. And then the teacher didn't really make us do any work for the rest of the day, so one of my classmates said, we should write letters to Mrs. Kennedy, and we did. And we got a letter back. I thought it was from her, of course, but it was probably her secretary or whatever. But I just remember that day, and I taught over in Tomah too, and I told this on 9/11. There were so many parents that came and got their kids, and a lot of us lived like 2 blocks from school. Everybody wanted to make sure their kids were okay, because at that time, we didn't know, it could be the Russians or some other country invading us. So there were so many people that had to make sure that their families were intact.
Sitting around the TV listening to Walter Cronkite.
And there was nothing on TV back when I was a kid. I'm like, well, what are the comics coming out? And those things, it was like 4 days, and that's all they had was coverage. And now I go back on YouTube and watch that
Me
stuff
too.
all the time.
Yeah, it was the most viewed television thing at the
But
time.
it left such an impact. I don't know if the rest of you feel that way. But
Sure. Every time I go somewhere, people say that, and everyone's got their story. Thank you for that. I hope you don't mind. I'll share one quick thing in response to that, because I'm in this Bobby Kennedy book I'm working on. It's called Becoming Bobby Kennedy, The Transformative Life of an American Icon. It's all about how much he changed between his brother's death and the final 5 years of his life. And he was kind of this rich, spoiled, brooding kid for a while, and then his brother died. He gave the rest of his life to trying to help poor people, try to end a war. I mean, he said if he wasn't a politician, he probably would have been a revolutionary. And it was kind of starting to look that way near the end. But there's a scene in the book where he gets the news of his brother's death, and he's sitting out by the pool at Hyannisport with 2 of his aides. They're just going to get some lunch and take a dip in the pool and then go back to, the Attorney General's office to get the work done. And he gets the call, and he sees he has a painter who's painting part of the house, and the painter's listening to the radio, and he comes running over, and Bobby doesn't know why this guy's running this way, and then the phone by the pool rings, and it's it's J. Edgar Hoover who kind of, shares the news. And just from there, it's more devastating. He finally takes his giant dog broom as a Newfoundland, and they go walk in the woods, and just, this grief was so profound for him. What he said to his friend that night was, I always thought it would be me. Because Bobby was the one who did all the arm twisting. He was the one who got himself in all kinds of trouble with Hoffa and the Mafia and everyone else busting all these heads, so he thought he would be the one. And of course, he would later be the one. But just a devastating part of the story. Are you up for one more minute, and I'll let you go? Okay, thanks. Thanks you all so much. Very, very generous. This is from the prologue of the book I just mentioned. I just like this little scene because I think it really embodies who I believe Bobby Kennedy to be, though again, a very complicated and far more complex person than Jack, I think, in a lot of ways. So here's the opening moment. In April 1968, 8-year-old Carrie Kennedy stared at the screen of her family's RCA Victor television set as the nation's cities burned. Dr. Martin Luther King had only been dead for hours when riots began to spread in cities like Washington, D.C., Chicago, Baltimore. Indianapolis might have endured the same fate if not for Carrie's dad, 42-year-old Robert F. Kennedy, the senator from New York, and the newly announced nominee for the Democratic presidential ticket. On April 5th, in the moments before Dr. King's death was widely known, Bobby stood on a flatbed truck in the misty rain on the corner of 17th and Broadway in downtown Indianapolis. "Could you lower those signs, please?" he asked the crowd. "I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee." The collective cry from the predominantly black crowd sounded like, quote, "a wounded animal," reported the Indianapolis Star. Nearly 60 years later, the scene remains one of the most iconic moments of the civil rights movement. A privileged white man standing before a black crowd and asking them to keep the peace, despite circumstances that hardly warranted it. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust at the injustice of such an act against all white people, I can only say that I feel in my own heart that same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, and he was killed by a white man. Bobby may have seemed an imperfect messenger, yet in some ways he was the only white man in America equipped to meet this moment directly. His unscripted remarks were so rooted in his own grief that his sincerity was beyond reproach. This was not some pandering politician speaking hypothetically about peace. This was Bobby Kennedy, a man who understood personally what it meant to lose a loved one to an assassin's bullet. That night he urged the crowd to choose compassion and love over bitterness and hate, and the crowd listened. There were no riots in Indianapolis. It was one of the few major American cities to be spared. Days later, as Carrie watched the burning cities from the television in their den, she heard her father, seated behind her, say, "I've got to go there." Bobby excused himself from the room, though Carrie's eyes remained glued on the TV for the next 45 minutes, horrified by the destruction of the country that her family had long served. Suddenly the camera pans, and there is Washington in flames, and there is Daddy standing in the midst of it, Carrie recalled decades later, right there on the screen. For me, no moment better illustrates who Bobby Kennedy was, the man who didn't leave for others the work he could do himself. The challenge is getting people out of the role of watching TV, Carrie said decades later, and into the role of stopping the flames. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate you here.
Thank you so much for coming down here tonight from Eau Claire. You guys need to stick around for a while. If anybody would like to talk to him more, take a look at some of his books, or even get one signed, he's going to be here for that. But thank you all for coming here again tonight. We have refreshments in the back. We have some juice, we have some cookies, and again, don't forget about next month's program on the 15th, which is another Thursday, where we have another wonderful chapter out of our history to share with you. There are those forms, and if you just take a moment to fill those out, we'd appreciate that. But again, thanks for coming here and spending your time here tonight. Don't leave in a hurry. We'll see you next month.
Talk about Mexico.
Oh, wait a minute. Oh, the Mexico story? You want to hear the Mexico story?
Yeah.
30 seconds. Oh, it's worth it. It's so worth it. All right. Wait, this is coming straight from Pat Lucy's son, Paul. So, allegedly true. I guess one day, John F. Kennedy's in Mexico City. He's doing a tour with the president of Mexico. They're in a parade route together in this kind of this caravan. They're in a Cadillac, and they're all waving to the crowd. And as they're waving, Jack Kennedy notices the president of Mexico's watch, and it's just a very lovely watch. And he goes, "Oh, that's just a lovely watch. I really admire that watch." And what he didn't know was that in Mexican culture, if you admire something, often it would be given to you as a gift. And so the Mexican president took off the watch and gave it to President Kennedy. And Kennedy was like, "Well, that's very kind. Thank you very much." Cut to that night at dinner. A beautiful Jackie is walking down the stairwell for dinner, and the Mexican president says, "Oh, your wife is just so gorgeous. I admire your wife so much." And Jack Kennedy says, "Here's your watch back." What a good way to end. Oh, thank you.